Welcome to the History Maps podcast. So, if you look at a linguistic map of Europe, there is a distinct expectation of order.
Right, it functions heavily, like a sprawling family tree. You can trace it.
Exactly. The Romance languages dominate the southern peninsulas, the Germanic languages span the north, and then you have this massive block of Slavic languages stretching east.
And linguists can look at where those branches connect, right?
Yeah.
They trace the shared roots back to common ancestral tongues.
You follow the roots and they make logical sense, but if you slide your finger to the very center of the continent, right to the Carpathian Basin, that neat family tree is completely shattered.
Yeah, it really is. It's an anomaly that is entirely isolated from every single language surrounding it.
It's the absolute definition of a historical and linguistic island. So the mission of this deep dive is to explore exactly how that island was formed.
Which is a complex process.
Very. We are examining the Hungarian conquest of the Carpathian Basin, an event known in Hungarian tradition as the Honfoglalás. This is part of our European history series.
And we should note the sources we're pulling from for this. We have historical chronicles, like the writings of the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII.
Right, plus archaeological discoveries from 10th century graves and some seriously detailed archaeogenetic data.
Because our goal here is to carefully separate the myth of some mass chaotic migration from the actual historical reality.
Which was a highly organized, elite-driven military conquest. I mean, this was an operation that permanently altered the geopolitical landscape of Central Europe.
It completely redrew the map.
But before we discuss the actual physical conquest of the Carpathian Basin, we must first establish exactly who the Magyars were. We need to know where they came from and how their society was structured on the eastern steppes in the mid to late 9th century.
That context is vital.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the name itself. We call them Hungarians in English, but they did not use that name to describe themselves, did they?
No, they didn't. The term Hungarian actually derives from onager, which translates from ancient Turkic to 10 Uyghurs.
10 Uyghurs. So it was like a geographic identifier.
Exactly. It was a political identifier used by neighboring groups on the steppe. As these people interacted with the broader continent, various European languages adopted modified versions of this exonym.
Right, like you see it recorded as Ungroi in Greek texts.
Or Ungari in Latin chronicles. But their self-designation, the internal name they used to describe their own confederation, was Magyar.
And linguists trace that term back to the fusion of two ancient tribal names, right? Menes and
Correct. And their language reflects a deep, highly complex history that heavily predates their arrival in Central Europe. The foundation of the Magyar language was Finno-Ugrian.
Which means if you look for its closest linguistic relatives today, you won't find them anywhere in Europe.
Not at all. You have to look thousands of miles away. You find those relatives in the languages spoken by the Mansi and Khanty peoples living in western Siberia.
But by the time we are focusing on like the 830s, the Magyar language had already absorbed heavy Turkic linguistic elements.
Which tells us a great deal about their geography and social interactions. Languages do not absorb loan words in a vacuum.
They have to be in contact.
Right. By the 830s, the Magyars were living north of the Black Sea. They occupied this vast grassland territory situated between the Danube and Don rivers.
A region known historically as Lavidia and later as Etelkos.
Yeah, and living on the open Eurasian steppe meant constant interaction. They had active trade and gradually absorbed other nomadic and semi-nomadic Turkic cultures.
Because when pastoralists trade horses or forge military alliances or intermarry with neighboring tribes, they absorb the vocabulary associated with those activities.
Exactly. That explains the heavy Turkic infusion into their foundational Finno-Ugrian linguistic base.
Now, their societal structure was organized as a tribal confederation. Originally, it consisted of what chronicles refer to as the 7 Magyars.
Those were the specific tribes of Nyek, Magyar, Kurtgyarmat, Tarzan, Jino, Ker, and Kesi.
But later on, they were joined by 3 dissident Khazar tribes called the Kabars. So that brought the total number of tribes in the confederation to 10.
And that inclusion of the Kabars is a critical detail for understanding their military capacity.
How so?
Well, the Avar Khaganate was the dominant imperial power on the steppe at that time. The Kabars were a highly militarized faction that had actually revolted against the Khazar central government.
Oh, so they were rebels.
Yeah. And when that rebellion failed, they broke away and joined the Magyars. They brought advanced military tactics, administrative experience, and distinct cultural elements with them.
So this confederation of 10 tribes wasn't just some loose gathering of herdsmen. It was a heavily militarized society.
Very much so. And that structure is most evident in how they governed themselves. They operated under a dual kingship, which was a system modeled directly on the Khazars.
Right, with two specific roles. The Khande served as the sacral or civil ruler, while the Gila served as the executive military commander.
And at the time of the conquest, a leader named Christian occupied the role of the Kende, and Arpad, the son of Olmos, was the Gila.
I want to look at how this dual leadership functioned mechanically. Could we use an analogy here? Like, was this system similar to a modern constitutional monarchy, where the Kinde is the monarch handling the spiritual cohesion and tradition, while the Gila is the prime minister running the actual executive power?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that constitutional monarchy analogy is highly functional. The Kinge was not merely a ceremonial figurehead to be ignored.
He had real authority.
Immense sacral authority. In a steppe society that heavily valued sacred traditions, the Ginde's approval was absolutely required to validate the actions of the confederation. He maintained internal cohesion.
But the Gila held the practical kinetic force.
Exactly. The Gila focused entirely on military strategy, defense, taxation, and physical expansion. This specific nomadic structure created a society that was permanently mobilized and highly adaptable.
And that constant mobilization was supported by a specific economic engine. They practiced semi-nomadic pastoralism. We're talking about massive herds of horses, cattle, and sheep.
Tens of thousands of animals requiring constant management. The logistics of semi-nomadic pastoralism are incredibly demanding.
Horses especially, right? They were the biological backbone of the society.
Absolutely. They provided tactical mobility, sustenance in the form of fermented mare's milk and meat, and the primary kinetic advantage in warfare.
And to maintain herds of that scale, the entire population had to move seasonally. They drove the animals to fresh pastures to prevent overgrazing.
But pure pastoralism, while it provides calories, does not generate hard currency.
Right. It's not enough to sustain a complex confederation that requires high-end manufactured goods.
Which leads directly to the other pillar of their economy, targeted raiding. They supplemented their economy by launching organized military raids against neighboring Slavic tribes.
They captured prisoners and then transported them to Byzantine ports, specifically the major trading hub of Cherson on the Crimean Peninsula,
where they sold these captives as slaves. In exchange, they received high-value luxury goods.
We actually have a detailed primary source from an Arab geographer named Ibn Rusta, who was writing around 930. He described the Magyars as exceptionally wealthy.
He documented that they wore silk brocade and carried weapons intricately inlaid with silver, gold, and pearls.
So we have to completely discard the stereotypical image of, unwashed barbarians wandering the plains.
Yes, the Magyar leadership represented a sophisticated, wealthy elite class. They were actively integrated into the vast trade networks connecting the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic caliphates, and the northern Slavic territories.
When a Magyar vanguard rode into a diplomatic meeting, those silver-inlaid sabers were calculated visual signifiers of a highly successful military system.
They were signaling their capitalization and power.
So we need to move to the geopolitical crisis that forced this wealthy society to abandon their territory in Etelkaz.
The migration was a calculated response to a collapsing steppe alliance system.
Right. Think of the Eurasian steppe as a massive billiard table. When a strike happens in the Far East, it sends tribal spheres crashing into one another all the way into Europe.
That mechanical transfer of momentum is exactly how steppe geopolitics functioned. It was an interconnected ecosystem.
So when military pressure was applied in the East, groups had no choice but to push westward into the next group's territory,
creating a cascade of violent displacement. In 893, a steppe confederation known as the Uzians decisively defeated another powerful group called the Pechenegs.
And the Pechenegs were a formidable military force. After this defeat, they fled west across the Volga River and arrived directly at the eastern borders of the Magyar territory of Etelkaz.
This demographic shift created a severe two-front problem for the Magyars. To the east, they were facing hostile Pechenegs desperate for grazing land.
And simultaneously to the south, the Magyars were deeply embroiled in complex Byzantine imperial politics.
Because in 894, the Byzantine Emperor Leo the Wise formally contracted the Magyar leaders, Arpad and Curzon, to form a military alliance against the Bulgarians.
The Bulgarians were currently ruled by Tsar Simeon. And the mechanics here are just standard imperial statecraft, right?
Exactly. The Byzantines needed a highly mobile proxy force to hit the Bulgarians from the north, and they possessed the gold to hire the Magyars.
So the Magyar army crossed the lower Danube, attacked the Bulgarians, and executed a highly successful campaign.
But kinetic military actions on the steppe always invite strategic reactions. Tsar Simeon was a seasoned diplomat.
He recognized that his heavy infantry couldn't simultaneously defeat the Byzantine army in the south and the Magyar cavalry in the north.
He needed to change the geometry of the war. So the Bulgarians dispatched envoys and forged a military pact with the very people threatening the Magyars' eastern border.
The displaced Pechenegs, this is exactly where the trap closes.
It is. While the main Magyar army, the bulk of their elite fighting force, was engaged far to the south fighting Tsar Simeon, the Pechenegs launched a devastating attack on Edelkos,
The undefended Magyar homeland. And the historical records of this specific event present one of the most debated discrepancies in early Central European history.
because Byzantine sources, particularly the official writings of Emperor Constantine VII, recorded that the Pechenegs completely slaughtered the civilian population left behind.
According to those imperial texts, the women, the children, the craftsmen, and the elders were entirely annihilated.
Which led some later 19th century historians to categorize the entire conquest of the Carpathian Basin as a panicked forward retreat.
The hypothesis was that Arpad returned from the Bulgarian campaign, found his homeland in ashes, and led an army of orphaned warriors blindly into a new land purely out of desperation.
But we have to question that narrative.
Right, because why should we inherently believe the Byzantine emperor's account? Doesn't Constantine VII have a massive conflict of interest here?
What's fascinating here is that questioning the imperial motive reveals the mechanics of early medieval political spin. Constantine VII was writing for an internal Byzantine audience.
With a specific political agenda.
Exactly. The Byzantine administration had essentially engineered this disaster by drawing the bulk of the Magyar army away into the Bulgarian war.
So if the emperor recorded that the Magyars simply executed a strategic retreat and relocated, it looks like a failure of Byzantine foreign policy.
But by heavily exaggerating the devastation, they could frame the loss of Edelkos as an unavoidable tragedy caused solely by the inherent savagery of the Pechenegs.
It shifts the blame from Constantinople to the brutality of the steppe, and we don't just have to rely on questioning the texts. Modern physical archaeological evidence soundly rejects the idea of a chaotic forward retreat.
The material culture leaves no room for debate. When archaeologists excavate the earliest 10th century Magyar burial sites in the Carpathian Basin, they document highly balanced male and female demographics.
Furthermore, they find uniform, complex funeral customs that require generational transmission.
If a massive army of Magyar men had arrived entirely alone and simply taken local women as wives by force, the archaeological record would reflect that trauma.
We would expect to see immediate differeces in female burial goods, varying grave orientations, and a breakdown of traditional steppe funerary practices.
Instead, the graves prove conclusively that the Magyars successfully transported their families, their specialized farmers, and their skilled craftsmen with them.
The Pecheneg attack undoubtedly forced the Magyars' hand and accelerated their timeline, but the move into the Carpathian Basin was a highly organized military operation.
They didn't just stumble blindly into a new geographic zone. They had been actively scouting the Carpathian Basin since 862.
Their intelligence network regarding the basin was extensive, wasn't it?
It was. Over the preceding decades, Magyar cavalry detachments had frequently operated within the basin as hired mercenaries.
They had forged and broken strategic alliances with local powers like the Moravian prince Svatopluk.
And through these engagements, Magyar commanders had mapped the topography. They knew the locations of the mountain passes, the depth of the major rivers, and the specific weaknesses of local empires.
So when the Pecheneg crisis erupted, the leadership utilized that intelligence to execute a well-prepared relocation.
The decision to abandon Edelkos was finalized. Now we look at the physical mechanics of the invasion of the Carpathian Basin.
Right, and how they systematically dismantled the existing political powers in the region. Here's where it gets really interesting. Executing this invasion required managing a complex logistical maneuver under extreme duress.
In the spring of 895, Arpad took command of the main military vanguard. He led this heavily armed cavalry force across the northeastern mountain passes.
The most critical geographic choke point being the Veric Pass.
Securing that pass allowed the mounted army to descend rapidly and establish a bridgehead on the Great Hungarian Plain.
At the exact same time, the civilian population could not risk that main military route. It was designed for rapid cavalry movement, not slow-moving wagons.
The vast herds of livestock, the heavy transport wagons, the elderly, and the children likely executed a separate maneuver through the southern Transylvanian mountain passes.
To evade the pursuing Pecheneg light cavalry. And by the summer of 895, against immense logistical odds, the Magyars had secured total military control of the Great Plain and Transylvania.
We really must pause to analyze the sheer mechanical scale of this achievement. Moving an entire functioning society across a jagged mountain range while under threat of annihilation is a masterclass in nomadic central command.
Just put yourself in Arpad's shoes for a second. You are standing before a mountain range responsible for moving an estimated 20,000 to 50,000 people.
Plus tens of thousands of horses, cattle, and sheep. The logistics are terrifying.
A single horse consumes roughly 10 to 15 gallons of water and 20 pounds of forage every single day.
You have to locate water sources for 50,000 people and a massive livestock train while bottlenecked in narrow mountain passes.
You have to keep the wagons moving over broken terrain, prevent herds from stampeding in confined spaces. The level of central command required to execute this without the society collapsing into starvation or panic is staggering.
It serves as absolute proof of the authority wielded by the Gula and the strict discipline of the tribal confederation. The penalty for breaking formation in such a scenario would have been immediate.
Once they successfully pushed through the passes and descended into the basin, the geography provided a massive strategic advantage.
The Carpathian Basin offered the perfect environmental synthesis for their way of life. The interior featured a broad, flat steppe, the Pannonian Basin,
which provided the immense grasslands required for grazing their vital horse herds.
But critically, unlike Edelkes, which was wide open to the east, this new basin was completely encircled by a formidable ring of high mountains.
The Carpathians acted as a massive geographic fortress, permanently defending them against future nomadic incursions.
After taking the initial territory on the Great Plain, they paused their military expansion. For a few years, historical sources are mostly quiet regarding Magyar movements.
They required this time to replenish their depleted livestock herds, repair equipment, and rebuild demographic strength.
But by 899, the economic engine required them to resume their expansion. They formed a military alliance with Arnulf, the king of East Francia.
And Arnulf utilized the Magyars in the exact same mechanical way the Byzantine emperor had as a devastating, deniable proxy force.
In 899, contracted by Arnulf, the Magyars launched a campaign across the Alps to attack King Berengar's forces in northern Italy.
It was a highly successful strike that demonstrated their capacity to project power far beyond the Carpathian Mountains.
And returning from this victorious campaign in Italy, the Magyar army did not just march back to their established territory.
They utilized their momentum to seize Pannonia, the region also known as Transdanubia, directly from their former Frankish allies.
This was a brilliant, if ruthless, strategic pivot. Having scouted the western half of the basin on behalf of the Franks, they analyzed the troop deployments, recognized their military superiority, and simply absorbed the territory.
The Franks were just too slow and overextended to mount a defense?
Next, they turned their attention to another former ally, the Moravians.
They launched systematic campaigns into Moravian territory, capturing critical regions like Nitra. By the autumn of 900, precisely 5 years after crossing the Vareka Pass, the entire Carpathian Basin was under unified Magyar control.
With the geographic borders secured, the process of permanent settlement began. The leadership transitioned from constant migration to territorial administration.
Arpad established his primary winter quarters in the southern region of the basin near modern Pécs,
where the microclimate provided milder temperatures for the herds. And he established his summer quarters on Sepal Island, a highly defensible island situated directly in the Danube River.
The Magyars rapidly began to transition from pure nomadism to a system of settled, permanent villages. The specialized farmers and craftsmen began to cultivate the rich soils of the basin.
But conquering the land and planting crops was only the first phase. Holding that territory against the established European empires was the true test.
The dominant European powers were not going to simply accept a massive, militarized nomadic empire establishing itself in the geopolitical center of the continent.
The Franks and the Bavarians recognized the Magyars as an existential threat to their eastern borders.
This friction brings us to a major, violent political shift within the Magyar leadership structure. In 904, the Bavarians initiated a diplomatic mission.
They invited the Kende, Kherson and his entire senior retinue to a feast near the river Fisha under the pretense of negotiating a peace treaty.
It was a calculated trap. During the feast, the Bavarians murdered Curzon and annihilated his entire diplomatic party.
The Bavarian objective was clear: decapitate the Magyar leadership. They believed assassinating the sacred ruler would throw the tribes into a chaotic war of succession.
But the assassination had the exact opposite mechanical effect. Following the death of Curzon, the Magyars did not reinstate the dual kingship system.
Instead, Arpad assumed sole, absolute control of the entire confederation. He structurally merged the sacred authority of the Kende with the executive command of the Gyula.
Was the assassination of Curzon a fatal miscalculation by the Bavarian intelligence apparatus? By attempting to divide the Magyars, did they inadvertently eliminate the only internal check on Arpad's power?
Unquestionably, it was a profound strategic error. The dual kingship inherently required consensus.
Right, the Gyula had to consult the Kinde before launching major initiatives.
By removing that layer of internal diplomacy, the Bavarians forced the Magyars into a highly centralized military dictatorship under a proven veteran commander.
Arpad no longer had to seek approval for his strategic vision. The entire military and economic output of the 10 tribes was unified into a single weapon aimed directly at Bavaria.
And Arpad immediately put that unified command structure to work. Between 902 and 906, the Magyars executed a series of campaigns to systematically neutralize external threats.
They completely destroyed the Moravian Principality in the north, erasing it from the map.
And they secured the strategic land between the Drava and Sava rivers in the south. This was critical because it ensured permanent access to the Italian plains for future campaigns.
Mechanically, Arpad was establishing a deep buffer zone. By aggressively pushing enemies back from the immediate physical borders, he ensured the civilian settlements on the Great Plain could develop in peace.
The fighting was kept strictly on the periphery, but the Bavarians were utilizing this time to prepare a massive, overwhelming military response.
That response culminated in July 907 at the Battle of Pressburg, an engagement also recorded historically as Breselsburg.
The Bavarians and the East Franks assembled a massive army. They marched eastward down the Danube with the explicit goal of expelling the Magyars from the basin entirely.
And this battle is a masterclass in nomadic tactical brilliance overcoming heavy imperial infantry.
To understand it, we must break down the mechanics of the opposing forces. The Bavarians advanced slowly and methodically along the river in dense, heavy columns.
They relied on superior numbers, heavy chainmail armor, and the brute kinetic force of tightly packed infantry formations.
The Magyars were heavily outnumbered, but they absolutely refused to fight a static, pitched battle on the Bavarians' terms.
Instead, they utilized dynamic holding maneuvers. They would ride up to engage the heavy columns, inflict localized casualties, and then execute a maneuver known as the feigned retreat.
They would suddenly break contact and ride away in apparent panic.
The Bavarians, believing they had routed the nomadic cavalry, would break their own disciplined lines to pursue the fleeing Magyars.
This raises an important question regarding how a highly mobile nomadic force successfully defends a static border against the heavier imperial army.
The answer lies entirely in their military technology and their tactical discipline. The primary weapon of the Magyars was the composite bow.
We need to explain how this works. A composite bow is not just a piece of bent wood. It is a highly complex engineered weapon.
It's made by laminating a wooden core with a layer of compressed animal horn on the belly, the side facing the archer, and a layer of stretched animal sinew on the back.
These materials are bound tightly with animal glue that takes months to cure. When drawn, the horn strongly resists compression, and the sinew strongly resists expansion.
This stores massive amounts of kinetic energy, far more than a standard wooden bow of the same size.
Furthermore, they utilized a specific technique called the thumb draw, using a hard ring on their thumb to pull the string back much further than a traditional finger draw allows,
which increased the draw length and the velocity of the arrow. Now, imagine firing this highly tuned weapon while riding a horse at a full gallop.
The Magyar archers were trained to release the arrow in the exact fraction of a second when all 4 hooves of the galloping horse were suspended off the ground.
That eliminated the vibration of the horse's footfalls, ensuring deadly accuracy.
The Frankish infantry, burdened by heavy mail and large shields, were incredibly slow. The Magyars used their unarmored, highly maneuverable light cavalry to ride continuous circles around the advancing columns.
They rained armor-piercing arrows upon them from a distance where the Frankish swords were useless.
And the feigned retreat is the hardest maneuver in ancient warfare. It requires absolute discipline to fake a panic without actually panicking.
When the Bavarians broke formation to chase them, the Magyars would wheel their horses around, close the distance, and destroy the disorganized enemy columns one by one.
In isolated, chaotic engagements, the aftermath of the Battle of Pressburg was absolute.
This decisive victory permanently secured the Carpathian Basin for the Magyars. The East Frankish military threat was entirely neutralized for generations.
The invasion was over. The occupation was permanent. Arpad, who was around 60 years old at the time, likely died around the time of this battle.
Cementing his historical legacy as the founder of the nation, Pressburg proved definitively that the Magyars could not be dislodged by European heavy infantry.
They were no longer a migrating tribal horde. They were an entrenched, dominant state power in the center of Europe.
So Arpad wins at Pressburg. The basin is theirs. But a few tens of thousands of steppe nomads just took over a massive geographic basin filled with hundreds of thousands of local inhabitants.
Which brings up a massive biological mystery.
Having established the historical narrative of the conquest, we turn to modern science to answer a complex question. Who were these conquerors biologically, and what exactly happened to their descendants?
For decades, historians relied solely on texts and basic material archaeology, which often led to circular debates.
But recent advances in archaeogenetics, specifically the whole genome sequencing of skeletons found in 10th century graves, have completely revolutionized our understanding of the Hanfaglalas.
When archaeologists excavate these 10th century cemeteries, they find a stark, distinct class divide. The elite graves are unmistakable.
These graves contain horse skulls buried alongside the warrior, intricate silver plates known as saber-tashes that hung from their belts, and specific weapons like curved sabers.
And the bone reinforcements of composite bows. These elite burials differ heavily from the simpler, commoner graves found in the exact same regions.
We need to explain how the genetic sequencing of these remains works. Geneticists look at different parts of the DNA.
Whole genome sequencing reveals that the individuals buried in these elite, weapon-bearing graves were a heterogeneous group, but a significant portion possessed deep East Eurasian ancestry.
Specifically, geneticists isolate Y-DNA haplogroups. Y-DNA is the paternal line. It's passed directly from father to son, almost like a genetic surname that rarely changes.
The elite warriors carried specific Y-DNA haplogroups, such as N1A, Q, and C2A.
These specific genetic markers show direct, undeniable biological links to modern Bashkirs, the Mansi people of Siberia, and ancient Hunnic or Xiongnu populations.
Populations that originated thousands of miles to the east.
So the ruling class, the elite warriors who actually executed the conquest under Arpad's command, possessed a strong, verifiable genetic signature linking them directly to the distant eastern steppes.
But the genetic profile of the commoners, buried in the simpler graves right alongside them, tells a completely different biological story.
Exactly. When geneticists analyze the remains in the commoner graves, those individuals overwhelmingly exhibited local West Eurasian genetic profiles.
These profiles represent the indigenous Slavic, Avar, and remnants of Roman-era populations that heavily predated the arrival of the Magyars.
This genetic disparity leads directly into the mechanics of assimilation. To understand this, we look at autosomal DNA.
Unlike Y-DNA, which traces a single direct paternal line, autosomal DNA represents your entire ancestral mix.
It's like a deck of cards that gets shuffled and divided every single generation. The elite Magyar males practiced what anthropologists call patrilical exogamy.
They settled down and married local women from the much larger conquered populations.
Because the Magyar conquerors numbered only in the tens of thousands, while the indigenous population numbered in the hundreds of thousands, the mathematics of genetics took over.
Over just a few generations of intermarriage, those distinct Eastern genetic cards were rapidly diluted into the massive local deck.
The modern biological result is striking. Today, modern Hungarians possess very little of the original conqueror's specific Eastern DNA, roughly 5 to 10% at most.
Autosomal DNA analysis confirms definitively that the modern Hungarian population is genetically extremely similar to their Central European neighbors.
Like the Slovaks or Austrians, the Eastern genetic signatures are still present in trace amounts, but they have been entirely absorbed by the local biological baseline.
And these precise genetic findings also definitively refute a fringe historical hypothesis known as the double conquest theory.
This theory proposed that there was an initial, earlier wave of Finno-Ugric speakers who entered the basin around 670, followed by a separate Turkic wave in the late 9th century.
The genetic data entirely rejects this timeline. The data points to a single, massive, defining migration and genetic admixture event occurring right around 895.
The hard genetic data confirms the narrative of the historical chronicles. The arrival of the Confederation under Arpad was the definitive, singular moment of military conquest and cultural establishment.
So we have this massive demographic shift.
So what does this all mean? Let me propose a historical analogy to make this demographic and cultural reality clear. We can compare the mechanics of the Magyar conquest to the Norman conquest of England in 1066.
In England, a highly organized, heavily armed, elite warrior class of French-speaking Normans takes over the absolute top of the social pyramid.
They completely changed the language of the government, the legal culture, and the geopolitical trajectory of the entire nation.
Yet, the vast majority of the biological population working the fields remains indigenous Anglo-Saxon.
That is a highly accurate mechanical comparison. The Magyars functioned as a specialized military elite.
They imposed their administrative structure, their political identity, and most importantly, their unique Finno-Ugric language upon a numerically superior local population.
The Magyar language was adopted by the locals for administration, trade, and social mobility. It became the unifying cultural force of the region.
Even as the distinct Eastern genetics of the initial conquerors faded away into the broader European gene pool.
It is a profound historical contradiction. The Magyars were genetically absorbed by the very people they conquered.
Yet it was the Magyars' language and their specific political identity that totally triumphed.
That singular identity defined the Kingdom of Hungary for the next millennium. The 10-tribe confederation, led by Arpad through the Varek Pass, laid the absolute, unshakable political and geographic foundation
For what would eventually become the formalized Christian Kingdom of Hungary under Saint Stephen by the year 1000.
Through rigorous military organization and complex adaptation, they transformed themselves from steppe nomads into a permanent cornerstone of European stability.
We have journeyed from the vast open steppes of Elkos, analyzed the brutal, calculated politics of the Byzantine and Bulgarian empires,
Navigated the terrifying logistics of the Carpathian Mountains, and unpacked the complex genetic reality of 10th century graves.
It's a story of incredible logistical achievement, military discipline, and cultural endurance.
It forces us to entirely reconsider how we define the origins of a nation and the mechanics of its history. I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder, circling all the way back to that linguistic map of Europe we discussed at the very beginning.
It really changes how you look at that map.
It does. The history of the Carpathian Basin proves that language and national identity are often completely decoupled from biological genetics.
When we study ancient conquests and migrations, are we simply tracing the physical movement of bloodlines and DNA?
Or are we actually tracing the movement of highly successful ideas, resilient cultures, and dominant languages? It prompts you to question how many other so-called vanished empires of the ancient world never truly vanished at all,
But simply assimilated into the genetic fabric of the people they conquered, leaving only their words behind to prove they were ever there.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.